The Achaemenid Empire by Donald Gray Lewis on December 11th, 2020 for pre-1500 Western history. The Persian Empire started when Cyrus the Great, who used to be a nomadic, I'm saying used to be as in terms of he used to be before he took over the Median Empire, used to be a nomadic farmer in the Pars type area, and then he decided to overthrow his grandfather who ruled Media, and from his control of the Median Empire, he went to conquer Lydia and Babylon as well. And Babylon's actually important from a biblical standpoint because he freed the captured, the detained Jews from Babylon and moved them back to Jerusalem, where he rebuilt it and had it as their capital. But Cyrus died in 530 BC, and Cambyses II became, which was Cyrus's son, became the new king of the Persian Empire. And while Cyrus already captured or conquered Lydia, Babylon, and Media, which is why he's called Cyrus the Great, because he was such a prolific conqueror and was able to spread this unified empire. But when he died in 530 of seemingly unknown circumstances, his son, one of his sons, Cambyses II, conquered Egypt, took over his rule and went to go conquer Egypt, and made that a part of his empire, of the Persian Empire, or the Achaemenid Empire. And for context of this picture right here, this picture is supposed to be the Tower of Babylon, and I don't know how accurate the Tower of Babylon is for reality, but it's a really cool picture, so I just use it for those purposes. Now, while Cambyses II was away conquering Egypt, a power vacuum had formed in Media, and Media is quite a far ways away from Egypt, and so a power vacuum was there because Cambyses used to be kind of this governor-esque ruler of Media before he became the next in line to become the king of the Persian Empire. And so someone was seeking to claim the throne of the empire because there was such a power vacuum. And there was a man named Bardia who decided he wanted to be king, and that he was the other son of Cyrus the Great. Now, Darius later on became to say that Bardia wasn't actually real, and that he was a usurper, a false king. But before that happened, Bardia took over for the while Cambyses was away. And while Cambyses got news of this and decided to come back to Media, but he died also under kind of unknown circumstances. And so Bardia kind of claimed the throne for that specific circumstance for a very short amount of time. And from there, Bardia became the Shah, which was the name of these kings in ancient Persia. The Shah of Shahs, they're the king of the Persian Empire. But after that, after Bardia was the king for a very short amount of time, Darius, which wasn't actually related to um, to Cyrus the Great like Cambyses and supposedly Bardia was. I'm saying supposedly because Darius made the claim that that wasn't the truth, so um, it's not sure whether really Darius was the king, because Darius claimed that Bardia was known as Gamada, um, a Zoroastrian priest trying to get the throne. He used that as sort of a propaganda to take over. And Darius found other members of nobility and convinced them that Bardia wasn't the real king. And from there, they decided to kill him. So they did. And they thought he was an imposter, and they found him as an imposter. So they executed him and made Darius the king. And the reason that Darius became the king is because he was related to Achaemenid, which is why it's called the Achaemenid Empire or the Persian Empire, because Cyrus claimed that he was a relative of Achaemenes. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly because it's kind of a intense word, but Darius took power in 522 because he also claimed that he was a relative of Achaemenes, just like Cyrus. In the first years of Darius the First, or Darius the Great king, there were many revolts across the different parts of the Persian Empire and parts of Persia, because many people were still strongly aligned to the now deceased Bardia, whether he was a imposter or not. And Darius, having a strong loyal army backing him, because of the six nobles or nobility that he had garnered friendship with and allied with, they suppressed the revolts and brought back stability to this great empire at the time. And it really was a great empire, because around that time when Darius the Great was the king of the empire, there was around 50 million people in the Persian Empire. And in that specific time period, in the 500 BCs, there was only around 150 to 160 million people in the world. So the Persian Empire was massive. It was really a huge portion of the world and was a huge superpower, of the world. And so after stabilizing his empire, Darius brought out several military campaigns, the first of which was to secure the lands Cambyses has conquered, such as Egypt and those general areas, and had started annexing large portions of Egypt to become a part of the empire. And he also invaded the Indus Valley and suppressed several other revolts through his kingdom during these campaigns. His final military embark was the Persian invasion of Greece in 1492, which didn't particularly end well for Darius the First. But he also, at that time, helped build roadways and like the Royal Road, I think was what it was called. And he also had a postal service and made the Persian Empire become more of a solidified empire, more of a state, like the United States. It was you could compare it to the United States in that way. That was more structured when Darius was the king. But Darius orchestrated the invasion of Greece due to the events such as the Ionian Revolt and other revolts surfacing from Greek opposition to Persian rule. The first invasion began in 492 BC, ending at the Battle of Marathon, resulting in a Persian defeat in 490 BC. A second invasion was being planned by Darius, with himself leading the armies, this time instead of his generals. He led the armies instead of the generals leading the armies. But before he could enact this invasion, he had died. After Darius the First's death, his son Xerxes was the first to succeed the throne. So Xerxes is now the king of the Persian Empire, which is quite large now. And with Xerxes' father's death, the Darius the Great, he took up the throne of the Persian Empire, as well as the plans of his father to invade Greece. He didn't begin the invasion of Greece until 480 BC, winning much of his early battles through eventually, he was successful, and by the end of the year, he invaded, by the year his invasion had come to an end, resulting in the defeat and withdrawal of the Persian Empire. In August of 465 BC, Xerxes was assassinated, though, leading to his oldest son, Artaxerxes the First, to become the new king of the Persian Empire. And I say the first because there are many Xerxes and many Artaxerxes after them, like Xerxes the First, second, and third, and Artaxerxes the first, second, and third. There were several of them that led the Persian Empire. During Artaxerxes' rule, the battle between the Persian Empire and the Greece came to a standstill, though he continued funding enemies of Greece in an attempt to weaken them. His death came in 424 BC, and his son Xerxes II came to power. See what I was saying with Xerxes thing. Xerxes II's rule was cut short after he was assassinated after 2 days in power by his illegitimate brother, Sogdiagonus. Not sure how to correctly say that, but that's how it was spelled. Whose rule was also stunted 6 months after he came to power. The assassin was his half-brother. So Sogdiagonus was also assassinated by his half-brother Ochus, who then came to power and assumed the royal name Darius II. So after Ochus became the leader or the ruler, he named himself Darius II as kind of like a ruler name, because Darius I was so great. And I'm not saying that sarcastically, he actually was. Darius II gave aid to both Athens and Sparta beginning in 412 BC, but eventually entirely to Sparta, allowing them to defeat Athens in 404 BC. Darius died the same year, anointing his son Artaxerxes II to power, who then killed his brother 3 years later. In 404 BC, Artaxerxes II came to power and was the longest ruling king of the Persian Empire ever, and led the country in relative peace and prosperity, constructing many monuments and relocating the capital back to Persepolis. I think that's how you say that. Though the beginning of his reign, the Egyptians had successfully revolted, and after an unsuccessful attempt to reconquer Egypt, the Persian Empire eventually regained control of the region. Artaxerxes II died in 358 BC and was succeeded by his son Artaxerxes III. So Artaxerxes III led an invasion into Egypt to reclaim Egypt from, because Egypt had kind of decided to become their own nation again, but Artaxerxes wanted to keep them in the Persian Empire. So Artaxerxes led an invasion to reclaim Egypt entirely in 343 BC. Ultimately successful, he plundered and looted the temples and destroyed much of the Egyptian infrastructure. Along with insinuating fear and high taxes, he made sure the Egyptians wouldn't revolt again against the Persian Empire. Artaxerxes was poisoned, though, in 338 BC by Bagos, and was succeeded by Artaxerxes IV, who was then also poisoned by Bagos 2 years later. Bagos then appointed Artaxerxes' nephew Darius III as the new king. And here we get to see the fall of the Persian Empire. So soon after Darius III took power, Alexander the Great began his invasion of the Persian Empire in 334 BC. And Alexander's invasion had torn through Persia. Within 4 years, he had marched upon Persepolis and forced them to surrender in 330 BC. Darius III retreated to Ecbatana, where he was captured and murdered by Artaxerxes V, also known as Bessus. Bessus then retreated to Central Asia and attempted to prepare an army to defend himself from Alexander's force. Before this could happen, he was captured by Alexander and put on trial and executed in 329 BC. So Alexander had declared himself the throne of the Persian Empire and had conquered quite a bit. Alexander had a humongous empire at this point. But he died in 323 BC of kind of debatable circumstances. There were a lot of things going on about that. If he was assassinated, or if he was poisoned, or if he died by malaria, it's really up for it's debatable about how Alexander died. But this struggle, because Alexander, though, when he was capturing Persia and when he was defeating the Persian Empire, he had put all of his generals in control in these different areas, and people he trusted of the different satrapies and whatnot. And he had made a lot of his own generals his governors, which when he died led to a struggle of the state being split into several different separate entities, as well as high taxes and crippling the economy, ultimately causing the empire to fall apart and dissipate into their own separate empires, which is where the Persian Empire fell and was no more. And that is the end of the Achaemenid Empire, or more commonly known as the Persian Empire.